Hi, I'm Carolina and I'm a librarian. Do you ever get disgusted by just how stupid you behave? Hey, today we'll be talking about historical costumes, historical costuming, whatever you call it, making your own historical costumes as a hobby, not a job. So basically, I started doing historical costuming about 5 years ago, and I wish I knew a couple of things I know now. I'm not saying that I'm an expert now. I'm actually one of the worst historical costumers I know that can't sew at all. Oh, I can hear it already.
No, your costumes are so good! Stop depreciating yourself!
No, they're not. I am aware of it. Like, it's because of my own laziness. I didn't bother to learn how to sew. I didn't bother to learn how to sew in a lining. I didn't even bother to be technically good. I know I could. I just was too lazy. So it's my own fault. I'm not saying I'm not talented enough or blah blah blah. I'm just saying, like, I know how it looks like. Most of my costumes are either unfinished with like raw edges and like threads coming through, or they fit poorly. You just can't see that in the photos because I'm smart. So basically, let me fetch my notes. When I was starting out, I had no clue about anything, but most importantly, I had no clue that internet is such a resourceful place. I think we kind of underestimate how many things you can find on the internet. When it comes to something like really precise or like really niche, you're kind of like, well, it's really niche. Great point, Carolina. But you have to remember that internet is indeed a huge place full of secrets and full of important and valuable information. Isn't it? You want to say something to the camera? You can say anything you want.
I am held here against my will and fed only carrots.
Basically, if you're looking for like a precise instructions or on how to make a complicated 18th century trimming, you are very likely to find it. And that's because of people of goodwill that write blogs or have websites dedicated to really niche topics. And basically, why do I keep repeating basically? It's not even basic. What I need to start. So first of all, I would advise you to narrow down the topic that you want to dig into, because if you're starting out and you go for like, I just want to learn about fashion history, because I remember because I often get comments like, can you recommend a single book dedicated to fashion history? Like a very good one. And I'm like, no! No, I can't, because if a book is dedicated to like the whole fashion history, obviously it's gonna be very, very like... and it's not gonna cover any topic properly because there simply isn't enough space in it or like enough pages. So what I would advise you to do is, instead of like trying to find one book and reading it and being like, okay, now I know it all, just narrow it down to at least one era, if not one decade, and just find stuff about that era or that decade. So if you're into Victorian stuff, you can either get a book on Victorian fashions, or you can even find something particularly about like 1830s and read articles and blogs about 1830s. And I think narrowing it down helps you, especially when you're starting out, not to be like overwhelmed with all this stuff, because I was like, I want to know everything, so I would read about 1840s and like 1900s and 18th century, and I would be like, I kind of know everything about all of these eras now. But the point is, you don't. Like, you kind of, it's like, here is the tip of the iceberg that you've read, and here is the whole knowledge that you could possess if you dig deep enough into one single topic. So with your first costume, I would advise you to narrow it down to at least a decade, if not to particular, let's say, couple of years or even particular year, and then it would be easier for you to make like decisions about what you want to make and find information. So once you've picked kind of your area of interest, you can now do some research, because what I didn't do when I was starting out was I would just go straight into it. I was like, I want a Victorian era dress, and I would just do it. Not a good idea. What is a good idea though is to read as much as you can about it. That's the first thing. And I will tell you where you can find information on the topic that interests you, but I will need to I'll have a look at my notes. Okay, first of all, obviously books. Be careful because some of them are rubbish. I won't tell you which ones because it depends. Some of the books are written by people that are either more into modern fashion and they kind of write about history of fashion because it sells, or just people that have no clue. And I think the worst books are the ones that are like really colorful and full of images. Those sort of like albums that you can get at like popular bookstores, because those are the ones that are kind of meant to sell rather than give you valuable information. So the best books are either the old ones that were written in like 1980s or like very specific ones. They're kind of made more for like people that do costumes professionally than for people that are actually just kind of interested in fashion history, because those are the people that would buy the colorful books, whereas the professionals would buy those books that are not so colorful maybe, but give you more valuable information when it comes to construction of the clothes and stuff. There are two books that are kind of the very base of historical costuming. If you're starting out, those are the two where you can find patterns as well. I will be talking about that later. There is Nora and Janet Arnold. This is so bad. So those two books are a good starting point, I guess, because they have at least one outfit from each decade of the 18th and 19th century, I think. Janet Arnold, it's like several editions of like different eras. They have sources from the era, quoting clothes. They have illustrations from the eras, they have patterns, they kind of analyze existing clothes in terms of how they're made and what techniques were used. These are all really informative. But these are also kind of more, as I said, construction based. So if you're looking for information on how something was made and like what was used for it, those are the books to check out. Another thing, and that's one of my favorite ways of doing research, is finding fashion plates from the era or like fashion magazines from the era I'm interested in and just scrolling through them and seeing as much as I can, because sometimes you can find fashion plates with some really odd examples that you could never see anywhere else. And I think it's fascinating to like have a look at them, because those were kind of ads of previous eras. Fashion plate was basically what a Vogue photo shoot is nowadays. It kind of was trying to sell the product, sell the new silhouette or like the new dress and stuff. As long as you're interested in like 18th century forward, you can definitely have a look at fashion plates. Before that, it can be a bit hard. A really good source of fashion plates is Pinterest. For some reason, I don't know, it just seems that most of the people that possess fashion plates simply just uploaded them to Pinterest, so it's quite easy to find. Watch out though, because sometimes when you type a particular date, some other dates show instead, so it's a good idea to always check with some other sources whether or not the fashion plate is correctly dated. And apart from fashion plates, another great form of doing research is having a look at like portraits and photos from the eras. That's particularly helpful when there are no other sources, you know, available. So if you're looking for like 17th or 16th century clothing, probably wouldn't be able to find fashion plates, so portraits are kind of a really good source. Another thing you have to be careful with is that, especially in 18th century, the clothes they wore on portraits weren't really worn every day, so like they would wear some special kind of like portrait clothing instead of what they would actually wear, so you have to be careful about that. I think the later the better, so like late 18th century and 19th century usually is believable when it comes to portraying people in their usual clothes, unless it's someone very rich, because obviously they would wear like all of the expensive stuff. Okay, so portraits, fashion plates, and existing clothing. Oh, my stomach just died. And it's really interesting because you can see the clothing on fashion plates and you can see the clothing on photos, but it's not until you actually see it as a piece of clothing when you understand how some things work. Because sometimes stuff looks really weird when it's, for example, painted, and then you see it and you're like, oh, okay, so this is what it was. And it's really educating to have a look at existing clothing, either in museums, because you can either have a look at like museums or museums websites, because most of the museums nowadays, especially the fashion ones, have their clothes digitalized so we can have a look. And sometimes they even do shots of details, which is extremely useful when you're looking for information on how something small was done, and you get like a really detailed, high quality picture of an, let's say, 1850s dress. And then some of the museums even introduced like 360 views. You can turn, let's say, the dress around to have a look at the back. The museums you should check out are like V&A, obviously, Metropolitan Museum, Kyoto Fashion Institute, Florence, I can't remember what the name was, Museum of London has some pretty good clothes, National Museum of Scotland, I think it was called. They have a pretty good collection too. Probably some French museums as well. I'm not really good at French, so I can't really search for like French museums. But basically there is a lot of museums that have their digitalized. Plus, this is kind of a sneaky way of doing research, but what you can do is you can find stores or like auction pages where they auction, you know, antique clothing, and there are usually very good detailed pictures, because obviously you want to know what you buy online. They would, for example, take a picture of what it looks like from the inside, or like they would take a picture of any kind of repairs that the clothes have been through, so that's also very informative. I think there is one called either Augusta auction or something like that. You can also just go on eBay and search for the clothing that interests you. Obviously they'll, you know, the older the clothing, the harder it would be to find, but if you're interested in like Victorian, Edwardian era, there's plenty of it online. If you're rich enough, you can buy it, but you don't have to, you know. You don't have to buy it to have a look at it. So that's that. If you have any antique stores nearby, or like some vintage shops even, they do have antique clothing. It's okay to just come and have a look. You don't have to buy it. I'm not saying you have to try it on, but you definitely don't have to buy it to just see what it's made of. Another source is costume blogs. What I mean by that is blogs written by people that are interested in fashion history, that are either professional historians or historical costumers. Especially the latter ones, they're very useful because they sometimes show how they make things, and it's a very good way to learn. There's a huge amount of those. Now, most of them are obviously American, because I feel the costuming community is the biggest in the US, and then when it comes to Europe, it's kind of like, in Europe it's much smaller. It's still big, like the reenactments are huge, you know, the Waterloo stuff, and I think it's not like the variety is smaller in Europe. I don't know. I mean, in Poland, for example, whenever I mention it as a hobby, people are like, people do that? They're kind of like so surprised. So anyway, there's plenty, really, like American Duchess, historical sewing, before the automobile, fresh frippery, wearing history, couture courtesan, beauty from ashes, festive attire. Now, what is kind of sad is that some of those blogs are dead by now. They still have really rich archives with like, oh, there's the Koshka the cat blog, which has really useful tutorials on, let's say, how to make 18th century petticoat, like a very easy one. Before the automobile is good in giving tips on like some really detailed tailoring and sewing. Historical sewing is a great resource of stuff like, will you stop moving furniture around? She's got like really good practical information on, my cat is meowing, on how much fabric you need for different eras, on where to find fabric, where to find laces, where to find trimmings and stuff. American Duchess has great tutorials on, I think, hair as well, and trimmings, I can't remember, but they're just so resourceful. There's just so much on them. And I have to be honest, when I was starting out, I wasn't really reading books that much. I was reading blogs. I was kind of trusting those people knew what they were writing, and I was like, Okay, I'll take that. So once you've done your research and you feel confident enough, you know, you've picked an outfit or a dress that you want to make, you should probably find a pattern. So the thing is, I know it's hard because when you do your first thing and you haven't done much sewing before, or you haven't done sewing at all, you kind of don't feel confident enough to do undergarments as well, especially corsets and stuff like that, because it seems very intimidating. But as I was saying in my previous video, the lack of corset makes the whole silhouette, like the whole outfit, unbelievable. Even using the cheap Chinese one is better than not using a corset at all. If you can't make one yourself, either order it or get a cheap one online. And this is probably the only tip I have for dealing with the corset situation when you're starting out, because you don't want the first thing you make to be a corset, because that's complicated. But at the same time, if you make the whole outfit perfectly but there is no corset involved, in most of the eras that's like a huge faux pas. And also some of the dresses are specifically, like most of the dresses are were specifically designed to fit a corset. For example, 18th century bodices are completely flat at the front, like there isn't much space for boobs because boobs were spilling out of the neckline. So if you don't have a corset, I can't really imagine how you even fit dresses like that. And then you have like Bustle era dresses and like Regency era dresses that have like really high bodices that there is no way you can fit those without a corset. And that's also why when some of my friends ask if I can borrow them one of my costumes, I'm like, I don't have a corset that will fit you, and those costumes are made especially to fit the corset. So like if you don't have that specific shape, you're just simply not gonna fit it. And it's not because you're fat, it's just because it's a different shape. So this is one of the biggest issues that you may have to deal with when you're starting out. What was I talking about? Patterns. Patterns are also easy to find, unless you're looking for something like really specific. But what I usually do is I find a basic pattern that sort of fits the silhouette that I'm looking for, and then I'm trying to figure out the rest myself. Sometimes it doesn't work out simply because I'm stupid. It also depends on the era you're looking for, but you can find plenty of patterns online. They're mostly free, unless, as I said, you're looking for something very specific. Then there is a chance you can find the pattern that you can buy. And there's also plenty of companies that make historical patterns, so like they are based on historical garment, basically remade into like a modern pattern, so you don't have to deal with like weird numbers and stuff. Those are companies such as Truly Victorian, Laughing Moon, and a couple more I can't really remember. If you write the particular thing you have in mind, pattern, in Google, they should come out. There are a couple of companies that make kind of stylized patterns, so like it's supposed to be historical, but it's not always historical. Simplicity and McCall's sometimes have patterns that are very good for historical clothing. Sometimes they seem to be like adjusted to modern silhouettes and they're not 100% historical. So I would look for like original patterns first, and then if that's not possible, try with the modern ones. As I said, in like Nora, whatever the hell her name is, and Janet Arnold have a lot of like basic patterns, like 19th century and earlier. That's one thing. Another thing is finding original patterns from the era. There is a cool Tumblr called Real Historical Patterns. They mostly have 19th, 20th century, but they're quite cool. Sometimes the patterns are a bit complicated. And then you have marquise.de website, which has some cool Victorian and Edwardian patterns as well. And what I like about the website is that the patterns they don't really have a scale, but they do have every single measurement written in centimeters, so it makes it really easy to follow, especially because the measurements are kind of really close to my measurements. It's really easy for me to draw the pattern and then fit the clothing. Another thing you should learn is it's really important for you to know how to adjust a pattern, because obviously Nora Waugh's and Janet Arnold's patterns are one size only. So basically you will need to know how to make them bigger, how to scale them, how to adjust them where you need to. Throughout the years I've learned that I need to adjust mostly two measurements. One of them is the waist, because my waist is always lower than it is on the pattern, and the other one is for some reason this measurement here, like my arm is always like too big. I don't know, it's not even that fat, but for some reason I always need to cut it like lower. So I guess the longer you do it, the more you know how you need to adjust the pattern to fit your measurements better. What you also need to learn is, surprise, surprise, you need to learn how to sew. It seems intimidating, but you have to remember it's a very technical skill. Like, it doesn't require any kind of natural talent. It's just like purely technical. And the only reason you're bad at it, like I am, is because you're lazy and you don't feel like learning about how to improve your sewing. Like using a computer. Like, it's really hard for old people because they've never done it and they don't really want to learn, but it's not impossible, and it's not like, oh, I wish I could do it, but you know, I have no manual skills, so I can't use a computer. Like, it doesn't work that way. It's just a machine and you just have to learn how to use it properly. The easiest way, for me at least, is to have one-to-one tutorials with someone that knows how to sew. So if you know a seamstress or have someone in your family that knows how to sew, I think that's the best way to learn, because courses are kind of like you're in a group. If you have an issue, you usually don't have time to solve it. Like, my sister went on a course, and apart from switching the machine on and like making a few stitches, she didn't learn much because the person that was hosting the course didn't have time to explain things to her. So I think it's best when you have like a tutor, be it someone you know or just the person that you hired, and they can show you everything you want to know, because some things are useless. Like, if you go in a course and they show you how to fix a zipper or something, that's useless in historical costuming. So you can ask for things that you really want to know how to make. I asked my parents to teach me, so they taught me the very basicest basics, such as how to sew sleeve, and then I made my first dress with their help, and then they obviously didn't have time to teach me more, so I had to learn myself. So another thing you can do is go online, as I said, because internet is a huge place. There is a shitload of tutorials on sewing, on trimming, on piping, I don't know, everything you might need for your historical costume. Okay, so once you know how to sew and once you have the pattern, you obviously need a fabric. And a very good idea, because the fabric can make or break your costume. If you use the wrong fabric, costume is gonna look either modern or ugly, or it's just not gonna work. And I've been there. I've used the wrong kind of fabric a couple of times, mostly because I couldn't afford a better one, but it's not a good idea. Doing your research, remember to also pay attention to what kinds of fabrics they mostly used, what patterns were used, because that's really important, like what patterns on the fabric were used. Like, flowers is not enough. Like, how big of a flowers were those? What kind of flowers were those? Were they like geometrical flowers or like really realistic flowers? The longer you're in it, the more you're gonna see the differences, and the more you're gonna know that some fabrics don't really work for some eras. For example, the most common mistake is like the wrong kind of flowers for late 18th century, because it seems like it's a bright fabric with like delicate flowers on it, it should work. The point is they had really like precise designs that they don't really produce anymore nowadays. A good exception is some IKEA sheets. So basically, if you go to IKEA, they have a couple of fabrics that are actually reprints of 18th century fabrics. They're used in the costuming community so often you have no idea, but they're a good alternative if you don't want to like spend money on something more expensive. So those are actually surprisingly historically accurate. If you have anything that's like pink and roses, that's probably not gonna work. On the other hand, you have no idea how many weird patterns they had in, let's say, Victorian era. Like, sometimes you look at dresses from like 1830s and there are like little lightning bolts on them. Some really weird geometrical stuff that's like asymmetrical and all over the place, and you're kind of like, were they drunk? But yeah, be careful about the patterns. If you're not sure what kind of pattern you can use on a fabric, it's better to just have a plain fabric with no pattern on it. So another thing is using the right sort of fabric. So you don't want to use, let's say, silk where they used cotton, or you don't want to use like really thick wool where they used linen, so it's good to know what they used. The other thing is, you can't always afford what they used. So for example, silk is extremely expensive. I've never used silk in my life because I can't afford it. What you also have to remember is that historical costuming takes a ridiculous amount of fabric. So like if you choose a costume, it's probably gonna be like at least 5 meters of fabric. It's not like you can just go there and be like, can I have 1 meter of silk please? Because this silk is like $50, but I can afford 1 meter. No, you have to spend at least like 300 on it. So it kind of puts things in perspective when a fabric is like $8, that's not too much, and then you go and have to buy 12 meters because you're making a bustle dress with like 1,000 of frills, so you have to have that in mind. And that's why I often use cheaper alternatives, which are modern fabrics with like polyester in them that are way cheaper than like cotton, wool or stuff. I used fleece for my 18th century riding habit because I couldn't afford enough wool. I use polyester all the time. I also use bed sheets for everything that's underneath, like for all the undergarments, bed sheets are the thing. And curtains. Curtains are a good thing too. Some things you can just get secondhand and there's just enough of fabric to make something from it. Curtains are usually really large, so they might be just enough for the dress you're looking for. And especially when you're starting out, you don't want to spend like hundreds of dollars on silk if you have no idea how to sew in the first place, so that's kind of logical to, you know, start with something cheaper first, and then if it works, go gradually, you know, save money and make better stuff. Also, avoid really shiny fabrics. Sometimes it's historically accurate, but most of the time it just looks cheap. I don't know, it's kind of like a pet peeve of mine. Okay, so you've made the whole costume and you're kind of done, and you want to wear it and you want to have pictures in it, but there's one thing you miss: accessories. And honestly, even if the costume is really plain or like not ideal or like not 100% historically accurate, the accessories can fix it so well. I remember I didn't really get that until one of my friends showed up at one of the events in like modern dress. She had gloves and she had the proper like 1890s hairstyle and she had some cool jewelry and a bag, and everyone was like, wow, you look like you stepped out of a painting. And she was like, that's my prom dress. It just takes the right accessories to like up the whole look like 100%. From that moment.
From that very moment, I understood how important it is to have the right accessories.
And it really is, like, it's about the hairstyle, it's about, like, if you look at either paintings or like fashion plates, they always have a shitload of stuff around them. I don't know, veils, hats, gloves, bags, shawls, jewelry, collars, ribbons, brooches, belts. There is just so much stuff they put on themselves. And that's also so much stuff you can add to improve your costume. The best way obviously is to get antique stuff, because there isn't anything better than having an antique umbrella, for example. Like, how much more historical can you get? But obviously, because those things are pretty fragile and they're really expensive right now and they're really hard to get, you sometimes have to make your own. Again, plenty of tutorials online. I don't even have to tell you where to look, just rewind the video. It's a really fun process, actually. I think it's my favorite part of making a costume, is just making all those kind of accessories and things that make it, you know, the costume. Yeah, I guess that's it. If I can tell you one more thing is, I'm not saying behave like you're in that era, because that's stupid. Like, I still want to have a selfie when I'm in my costume, but be careful how you move, because that kind of affects how the costume looks. And also, when a picture is taken of you when you're posing, it looks really cool if you're trying to recreate the poses they were doing back in those eras. So for example, Victorian era is kind of like the strict posing with like hands together, and it looks actually surprisingly good when you're wearing a costume and you do the pose, and you're just kind of like, that's one of those things that make people say, oh, you look just like 1840s. Whereas if you do like modern posing, it doesn't really do the job. So study like portraits or photos from eras you're interested in, try and recreate them, and it's really cool. It gives you like a really cool effect when a photo is taken of you. Okay, that's it. I haven't eaten breakfast and I'm dying, so if you'll excuse me. Oh, shit, I forgot. I forgot to say, to encourage you and say good luck and say that costumes are fun and it's worth trying, and if it doesn't work the first time, don't be discouraged, and have fun and show me the results. If you ever make a costume because of this video, share the results with me, because I'm dying to know what your first costume will look like. And I promise I won't tell you it looks like crap. Thanks and goodbye.